even in the best conference program, you find a mistake or a thing, which is that we know that early afternoon sessions are always very quiet because it's after lunch. And if you invite a speaker from the most boring science, which is law, it is an invitation to an afternoon nap. So it's take a nap if you need to, and I will try to present very briefly very few things, because what can you add? Now, we heard many different genres here, and from a fascinating cross boundaries between social science or social sciences and natural sciences, philosophical encounters, even apocalyptic mission led by scientists, and a welcome to activism. And I'm afraid I'm gonna contribute with what we Central Europeans are talented in. So a pinch of salt of skepticism and self-criticism. So it's that's why the title is slightly different from what is on the program, but what I want to say here is basically, for many years, social science was, or when it was established, it was considered either as as part of philosophy and humanities, or as an empirical data collector for decision-making, policy-making, and improvement of reality. And even after the Second World War, and we heard and we saw fascinating examples on the graphs that sociology was expected to have imagination. And scientific imagination was expected to resolve political conflicts, environmental conflicts, civilizational conflicts, and some philosophers and social scientists even believed that if you have the principle of responsibility invented by philosophers and social scientists together, then you can, with this simple principle, you can sort out the most complex problems. And we heard a wonderful presentation about complexity and entropy. And I want to add a little bit on how the imaginary reality, that we should move from sociological imagination, social imagination, that was the legal imagination expectation, to something much more sober, something much more self-reflexive, which is sociological enlightenment, where that we actually know that science doesn't have all answers to all to our problems, that we must employ, in other words, not just one reason, but different rationalities operating in modern society. Economy has its rationality with the market and profit and loss. Law has its rationality with legality, illegality. Science has its rationality with truth and falsity. If you cannot falsify it is not science, it is ideology, as we know from Karl Popper. And as we know from another great Central European mind, Isaiah Berlin, in every society there is value pluralism. So the biggest danger is to expect that you find a value-based politics which can be enforced, because no, we have to have a reasonable dissent as much as consensus. So let's praise value pluralism, because values are quite high explosives, as we know. We are here in Prague. It's not just the city of Franz Kafka, it's also the city of Karel Čapek and his Továrna na absolutno, Absolute at Large novel, in which he said that people launched the most destructive wars and civilizational collapse by wanting more good. Yeah? And technology was very much part of it. But let me move on to how can we describe the current crisis of trust in knowledge and trust in reason and reasonable discourse. It was interesting that in the morning, the very first contribution was praising Jürgen Habermas, a German philosopher who basically made German public sphere more pragmatic, more American, who brought American philosophical pragmatism to German idealism, and now American pragmatists are asking a German idealist for help. It only tells you how dire the situation in the United States must be in terms of the collapse of reasonable politics. Let's, however, move to the European Union and the rise of populism, and I will tell you what it means in terms of imaginaries. We are in, because society is functionally differentiated, and yet what is interesting is that society presents itself as one self. And this self-presentation, as Ernest Cassirer, another great Central European mind, said, we share it. These symbolic forms of thinking is shared between science, myth, language, and it shows the creative spirit of humanity. So there is one origin, which is in the possibility of symbolic thinking, and different symbolic forms always refer to humanity. However, in politics, there are different imaginaries. One imaginary is the imaginary of political society, which is constituted by the unity of what we can call from Greek, topos, ethnos, nomos. Territory, nation, laws. And now we know that we live in a complex society. Again, complexity. We live in a complex global society in which this imaginary has been significantly weakened. I'm not saying it's useless, but the role of nation states has been completely transformed. And ever since 1960s, sociologists, political scientists, legal theorists are talking about the decline of the nation state. And it corresponds not just with globalization, but also with Europeanization, which is one response to globalization and one part of the process, one segment of globalization. And here we can use it as a case example of what is profoundly problematic in political and legal globalization today, and why we are at the crossroads. We are indeed at the crossroads. We are in critical state of our, not just civilization, but also of our democratic politics, of the rule of law, as you can see in the case of Hungary, but in the European Union, but also of economic prosperity, social justice. We just learned about it. What is a problem? The problem is more general. It's a growing public distrust of technocracy and expert knowledge. Yeah? It is, we heard in the morning about QAnon. I loved one Facebook image of smallpox saying, if there was internet at my time, I would still be with you. Yeah? It's fascinating how the most rational technologies lead to the most irrational feelings shared, circulated, and pursued in real life. Well, public anger, it's one reason is, of course, Marxists would say it's economic inequality. Again, we just learned about it, and it's a real issue. It's a big issue of these growing inequalities and actually the limited life opportunities and life chances. So populists and general failure of anti-majoritarian institutions to address issues of this social justice or injustice. Populists so far mainly exploit the framework of constitutional democracy, whether it's Marine Le Pen, whether it's in other countries. You can even say that even in Poland the question is, the problematic is the rule of law but not the democracy itself, because the opposition is still fighting back. Italy has the populist government of the 5 stars, and so on. The case of Hungary is, however, different because their democracy stopped working. And why? Because if you know who's going to form the next government, it's the end of democratic game. The greatest benefit of democracy, we have many definitions of democracy, and I could name you Churchill, I could name you Popper, I could name you others. The greatest benefit of democracy is that you never know whether you end up in opposition or in government. And it's, I don't know how many weeks it is to the Czech election, but let's wait and see and do something. Okay. Sociology of constitution as power formation, we can move, but this is about the theory of social imaginaries. It became quite influential theory how to cope and how to understand what's going on in law, in positive law, or in politics. And it's been informed by either philosophy of Cornelius Castoriadis, Claude Lefort, but also Benedict Anderson, who wrote a famous book about the rise of modern nations as imagined communities. Again, being in Prague, you know that when I say národní obrození, national renewal, you immediately think of a nation as almost being reborn, reawakened, yeah? As if the nation were sleeping for centuries and all of a sudden you wake up and you're there. Of course, all nations are invented, and they are invented through the imaginaries. Charles Taylor, philosopher, 25 years ago, had a series of lectures on modern social imaginaries. And these lectures would fit perfectly into what we heard in at the morning panels. The imaginary of market as spontaneous force where people exchange their products but also ideas, and where they can accumulate capital and invest. And this is one. Obviously, democratic government. We learned that democracy was one of those landmarks. Democratic government as a source of participation in politics, which is not something we take it for granted and something automatic, but it's not for the vast period of history. It's not how human politics was being run. And also rights. So Taylor says it's the market, it's democracy, and it's democratic statehood, and it's human rights. Basically, government is limited. No government is absolute. We learned about the Glorious Revolution, which wasn't a revolution, which wasn't glorious, but which brought the limited government and certain rights and guarantees which evolved over the time. So social imaginaries are simply those images which define how we, and this is very important, how we understand and perceive our social reality. And not only how we understand, but it gives meaning. It makes our political life meaningful. That's very important. Again, let me, however, make a short caveat here. The imaginary of the public sphere is, there are two big different ways of understanding what is the public sphere. One is it like this? Yes. Hobbes, we learned about Hobbes. Hobbes came with this famous statement, auctoritas non veritas facit legem, which means that it's authority and not truth which makes laws. And of course, he had all reasons to say so, because this is the time of confessional wars in Europe, of the biggest disaster, when people were fighting for their truth, for their concept of and their values. You're Catholic, you're Protestant, and in England you have the Civil War, and you have the Puritanic Revolution, and Puritanism is a fascinating intellectual and spiritual development in modern Europe, and we learned about the age of modernity. It's interesting how this age of modernity was informed by spiritual values, and Max Weber wrote a famous study about spirit of capitalism and Protestant ethics. To this Hobbesian version, however, we also want to believe that it's that it's, oops. No, where am, I'm finished. I will carry on with, Immanuel Kant says, all these laws have to express, it's veritas, non auctoritas, that facit legem. It's that what is the legitimation? The source of legitimation is truth. And the problem with truth is that in modernity is, as Isaac Berlin would say, we have different notions of truth. So what is important is it's not just the scientific reason, there is also communicative reason. We heard about communicative action, communicative reason, and for us it means that, thank you very much, that's extremely helpful. Thank you. And yes, so I'm there with Habermas, and Habermas still believes that is the reason which is the ultimate. Wait, okay, well, yeah, yes. I want to do this. No. So that Habermas believes that it's the potential of reason which gives meaning and functionality to our democratic politics. Well, where is the problem then? It's not in this division itself. The problem is that political reason is not then the reason of scientists. It's not the reason of science. But if it's not the reason of science, what is it? And there is an interesting dispute these days. On the left, some politicians want to mobilize the masses because the masses have the reason, and they call it the populist reason. Against this, extreme right or populist right, they always go, they say, first of all, of course, the masses, we have our masses, it's common sense, common wisdom, we don't need scientists because they are always wrong. And of course, we know that scientists are very often wrong. It's in their job description to be wrong. Yeah, and but the problem with the public sphere is that you have the difference between doxa and episteme. Public reason is always doxa. It's about opinion formation. And opinion is always temporary, and it's always structured through some consensus, persuasion, and after all, democracies are always about persuasion. Against this is episteme. It's the voice of science. And you would have to be a nihilist to ignore, or ignorant, to ignore scientific voice, even in politics. But the problem is that the technocratic sphere, which is related to episteme, expert knowledge, is expanding. And political doxa, political persuasion, is diminishing. I can illustrate it with the Brexit story, when old Labour voters were saying we stopped voting for Labour because they behaved like our managers. Yeah? Our party leaders simply came and said, do what we tell you, we know better. And this we know better, of course, because we are managers, because we are lawyers, because we are scientists, creates a tension, because in democracy, everyone knows equally well. Yeah, you cannot, we can see it in, and this is the paradox of democratic politics. And we know that expert voices are not unanimous, authoritative, and generally valid, as expected by members of the whole polity. And it is left up to the politicians, dependent on the public opinion on doxa, to decide which expert knowledge should be followed and measures taken in their political decision-making. And it's a big art of politics today, which expert voice, which expert advice to follow. We can see it in COVID. Yeah? I must say, one of my biggest heroes of COVID, apart from nurses and care workers, is Anders Tegel, that Swedish top hygienist who is a civil servant, and who it takes a strong courage in democratic society to keep an expert in charge of COVID pandemic. And you know how Sweden went, a different route. And after a year, he said, well, if I had all data that I have now, a year ago, I would have made a different decision. Yeah? And what is fascinating that in Sweden, this is not a call for resignation. This is a call for making better decision and better informed decision. Yeah? Decision making. And we know that experts on COVID will have different views, but politicians have to make a decision. So doxa and episteme will be in permanent tension. This is something complicated, and I'm coming to the final part of my presentation. This is complicated with another pitfall of democracy, that we start believing in the reality that there is something ultimately real and authentic that we call the people, the nation, or any other community. Richard Sennett, distinguished sociologist, says, well, that we live in interesting times when community, the spirit of authentic community, becomes a weapon against society. And today, community, because community promises authenticity. This is how things are. This is where you belong, the question of belonging. And you don't need to look any further, just listen to us. The question of belonging is actually the most important question of and one of the biggest problems of globalized society and global politics. So there is a tension, and authenticity is another name for truth and honesty, and society is seen as alienation, alienating society. We don't want anything from outside. This is this lack of innovation because you believe that you are just searching for your authentic roots, for your authentic community, and you don't need to look any further. Well, what we witness in globalized world is actually what Zygmunt Bauman 20 years ago already called explosive communities, communities that believe in authentic alternative to alienating globalization. And this is exactly this politics of identity and authenticity, invoking the promise, and it's a quote from paradoxically a Marxist historian, Eric Hobsbawm, who made this comment that this is a promise of safe haven for those who feel threatened by and alienated from the forces of the endless and seamless processes of modernization currently taking the form of globalization. So if modernity is a unique advancement, and I would sign it to everything that we heard from Jan in the previous panel, there is the other side of the modernity coin. And this is this alienation and search for authentic community, which ends up in explosive communities, because we live in the period when different communities respond by different means to this globalization, whether it is fanaticism and fundamentalism based on religious, national, ethnic, any other grounds. This is one. There are many forms of explosive communities. This recursive return to even ethno-nationalism is part of it. This is not a return of nationalism as we knew it in the 19th century. This is a very different kind of nationalism, which is recursive, which is self-insulating. This is that Make America Great Again was actually about let's return to what we had in the past. And of course, it wasn't there in the past. So how can we do, what can we do as Europeans about it? As Europeans, we know that we have different constitutional imaginaries, not just topos, ethnos, demos, topos, ethnos, nomos. Not just the unity, polity, our polity is not just the unity of territory, nation, and law. What European integration brought is this fascinating and unique combination of learning to live with legal pluralism, that we know we can live in pluralistic societies. We know that a lot can be done by governance and administration, that bureaucracy isn't just a threat, but it's a great benefit. It's this administrative governance. We know that the market can be a source of prosperity, and the European market with its social market economy and welfare is an example of it. And the fourth one is what I want to conclude with, that we need European democratic politics. And how it's going to be imagined and shaped is at stake, and that's what I want to briefly talk about, that authenticity will play a role in it. First, European pluralistic doxa. Yes, we have many different public spheres in Europe, And it's not something detrimental. It's something that we can use as overlapping political imaginary of public spheres. And so pluralistic public spheres can integrate democratic conflictual politics. Finally, I do not see, we are at the crossroads in Europe. European integration can fail, and with the next economic crisis, with a strategic geopolitical crisis, it can fail, but it can also come out much stronger, like during COVID. After the initial fiasco, you have a sensible policy applied, and the response, after all, wasn't bad. Just look at the situation in United States. But I don't want to over-politicize COVID here. Second is, doxa is democracy. If you have many public spheres in which you need to steer democratic conflicts, you need democracy. And this is a big step from federalist dreams. Federalist dreams are dead long time, but it shouldn't lead us that Europe can be technocratic. Europe cannot be technocratic only. Europe cannot be just legalistic. Europe has to be shaped through democratic imaginary of democracy, many nations working to working together and governing together. And it's not just some nice European cliché. This is something which is extremely important for any democratic community that wants to survive in transnational global society. This democracy recalls one important Roman law principle: quod omnes tangit. Basically, all those who are affected by decision-making should be taking part in it. And this is a big challenge. We heard about it in the previous presentation, because we are very often affected by decision-making which we have no influence over. So participatory transnational democracy, democracy as the biggest challenge for us all, and this is the only way how we can create democratic communitas which would be European transnational and which would gain some legitimacy to counter explosive communities growing all around us. Thank you very much.
Okay, many thanks, Professor, for the fascinating talk. Now we have time for questions. I hope that you've overcome your after-lunch fatigue. So please raise your arm if you have any questions. Okay, Professor Weg.
Yeah, great talk. I was wondering, one thing is not so clear to me, because you said that current populists in Europe are not the same as the populists in the 1930s. I may have missed that. I don't see the difference.
The current populists, so far, the vast majority of them don't offer political alternative. They just exploit the existing system of a constitutional democracy. So I'm pretty sure that even if Marine Le Pen wins the presidential election, it's not the end of the French Fifth Republic. Yeah, so it's not, there is no alternative. United States survived Trump, in other words, yeah, and Trump was very destructive. A fascinating example, historical example of the first president who was purely relying on doxa and no episteme. When I was asking my American colleagues and friends, he said, so where is some think tank behind? Every American president up until then had some advisors, not necessarily Henry Kissinger, but there was always some school of political, economic, juridical thought, yeah, that presidents were using. And they told me he is the first post-intellectual president of the United States. Yeah? And he created a lot of chaos, but he didn't destroy the system, and he didn't have an alternative, which is very different, for instance, and I wanted to draw a distinction here between populists like Trump, Cinque Stelle on the left in Italy. After all, even Czech Prime Minister is closer to Berlusconi than to Viktor Orbán so far. But Viktor Orbán has had an alternative project, illiberal democracy. Basically, you work towards the wealth and welfare of the nation, and liberties follow the wealth of the nation and the nation state. He formulated it in 2014, and since then he has been doing all he can and even cannot to dismantle the democratic regime there. So it's a big problem for the European Union. Can an autocratic regime be a member state of the EU? Maybe not seen as a big question from the United States perspective, but certainly a big question for transnational European politics. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Do you have any further questions? I may add that I think it's okay to ask in Czech. I think Professor Přibáň will be able to respond. Okay, if you're still thinking about questions, I do have one, or there is one?
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, sorry, okay. I'll have the question afterwards. I'll let my colleague take the microphone.
Well, so I was wondering, of course, we can be at conferences and talk about what is the ideal way of, well, enacting the vision that you've presented to us. But what do you think needs to be the practical policies from a point of a policymaker in order to achieve some of the goals that you've outlined?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Thank you. It's a political question. I think my presentation was driven almost like by argument that there are imaginaries beyond nation state and the democratic rule of law based on statehood, and that's what I try to demonstrate that in European condition, which is part of globalization, these imaginaries are evolving. Yeah? Whether we like it or not, this is not a matter of decision making, and they are. Yeah? You're absolutely right when you point to the problems of European decision making. Yeah? And European politics creating not just consensus, but steering and decision-making powers. And the response to COVID would be a good example how we didn't understand what was going on, of course. We knew something was coming, something we didn't have experience with, unlike Asian countries and the initial response was really erratic. Yeah, but also at nation-state level, at European level, the problem of Europe is that it is slow. It is slow, it continues to be informed by national politics. Just when you look at the European response to, yesterday, what happened in terms of geopolitics was the formation of a pact between United States, Australia, and Great Britain. And Europe is absolutely furious, and justly so, because it diminishes, of course, the French security in the Pacific, and Europe as a global player. So I think at level of practical politics, what we're gonna see in future will be increasing contestations between democratic legitimacy and expertise, and at the same time increasing push to the limitation of nation states. And the question how this limitation of nation states' power is gonna evolve, we don't know, but we know that it will have to be limited, and we are already experiencing it. So there will be a future crisis will initiate future transfers and responses to the transfer of European power. For instance, another example that I can give you, Eurozone crisis that we heard about, how economists gambled, basically. It was all advocated by experts. Yeah, nothing can go wrong with subprime mortgage crisis. Yeah, it's all fine. Yeah? You just slice and resell toxic mortgage and toxic debt and send it elsewhere. It's like environmental crisis. And 10 years on, the financial system or the financial subsystem of European Union looks very different. So it's one example. Don't expect one giant change in policy making, but evolutionary approach to European decision making.
Okay, any further questions? Okay, I do have a question. So if the audience is thinking, I find the topic of imaginaries absolutely fascinating, and I wanted to ask you, because you mentioned that through imaginaries, people do find meaningful frameworks through which they perceive the world, they see the world as something that is that they can comprehend. It's not something haphazard, not something absurd, and so on. And also through which they can get a sort of sense of wider, broader belonging with the society, as you mentioned, as the self, and so on. And it seems to me that this imaginary, because we often contrast the word imaginary with the word real. It cannot be just any kind of imaginary, right? It has to be something that has a grip on the public imagination, that has some teeth. And I was wondering how optimistic you are that this democratic, transnational imaginary that we may postulate in our intellectual cycles will actually have that kind of a grip. And how is it possible that the sort of more primitive, so to say, imaginaries do have such teeth?
Yeah, I think you highlighted something which I didn't emphasize in my talk too much, but because this is an interdisciplinary gathering, and also gathering about social singularity, what is so unique. And I try to show that even science is, and we heard Jan had a presentation, how science is actually socially and politically not embedded, but contextualized. Yeah? If you don't have social structures for the expansion of scientific knowledge and transformation of scientific knowledge into technologies, which then start making impact on everyday life. Of course, people knew steam engines long time before James Watt, but it was him who put it on rail, and this is how it started. So my work with imaginary, you're absolutely right. I said that this is meaningful, and what I try to argue is that the way we understand our world is not based on some categorical, rational knowledge only, which would be universally binding. And it is based on preliminary understanding, something that Hans-Georg Gadamer called truth and method, that it's all in method of understanding, and the way we comprehend, we understand and make our reality meaningful is shaped not by instrumental reason only, but by social reason and social rationalities. And this is what makes modernity so unique. This is why we need this sociological enlightenment, in which we know that science is an important episteme, but only social doxa, which is limited. The truth in science is great because it can be falsified. The truth in politics is an opinion which can be overturned, and therefore which has to be always at stake. Yeah? And this is conversational politics. This is politics of inclusion, not exclusion. And our big problem is that we ceased to perceive politics as a tool of engaging in dialogue and engaging in argument and engaging in disagreement. We started using it as a tool of affirmation of our truths. And this is always a way to the absolute at large. Yeah, to Karel Čapek. And Karel Čapek, our foreign guests probably don't know, but he was a Czech novelist nominated for the Nobel Prize and close collaborator and spiritual comrade of Czech president, Czechoslovak president Tomáš Garrigue Masaryk. And he was what is his unique contribution to this part of Europe, which is so heavily burdened by idealism and speculative philosophy. He brought American pragmatism. And he said, we have to give up the idea of absolute truth. We have to work through small truths in which we can find common denominator of humanity.
Okay, thank you. We've got time for one more question, if there is one. Okay, there is one. So the gentleman in that dark blue shirt, whose name is Martin, because I know him.
Thank you. I would like to ask if we have those national imaginaries and then we have these European imaginaries. Don't we have like global imaginaries for these two kinds of people in society? It's like these city liberals and these and more conservative people in the regions. Let's say there is this like idea of divide between like winners and losers of globalism. Isn't it imaginary which can be stronger than the European or the national one?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think you raise a very important, if not crucial, question of political globalization. Who is the winner? Who is the loser? But let me start with the difference. There is a lot of economic globalization. Today, yeah, if I do my strip show here, you would see in how many different countries everything that is on me and in me was made, yeah? And so economic globalization is a simple fact of our everyday reality. Those who say that economic globalization is detrimental, they completely forget about how countries such as China, India, and other countries, how they resolved their basic question of feeding the population, of making it more affluent, making it more prosperous. And obviously there is a huge cost, which is environmental cost, environmental damage, but this is our export. We export the production, and this is how we deal with environment, for instance. And we also export, this is what was cheap labor done locally is now cheap labor done globally. And these tensions are something which fuels populism, populist backlash. But I don't believe in this sharp distinction of anywheres and somewheres, yeah, as it said, that people who are from somewhere dwelling in their national communities, imaginary communities, and anywheres, people who benefit from globalization. Globalization is much more complex, and even politically, and Europe would be an example of it, is that today issues of and that's what I meant to say, that quod omnes tangit, that all those who are affected should be made part of decision-making process, because, and this means, for instance, issues of public participation, and protest movements, which of course we know have only very limited effect, but public participation, social justice, and I don't want to speak about these highly abstract terms without a specific example. It's a lawyer in me, so I can give you a specific case. Today, health law is completely globalized, but what health law wouldn't be globalized without those affected, for instance, by AIDS. So this is the 1990s, when human rights activists and local patient organizations simply took on pharmaceutical companies and used the legal systems in South Africa, elsewhere, simply to push pharmaceutical companies into providing and guaranteeing generic treatment. So this is how even social justice at global level operates, and I think one shocking example of it, we heard about how, for instance, pharmaceutical companies became less innovative. This was great learning lesson to me. I know that, for instance, it happens with antibiotics and so on, but at the same time, how much more profitable they became. So they say that today you don't want to invest in illegal drugs, you want to invest in legal drugs, yeah, because this is the most profitable industry at global level. And so we have to address the question also of how business can actually slow down science and innovation. So it's not just political activism, it's business interests which can actually be harmful to human innovation and to research. A great book, by the way, since you mentioned it, these imaginaries, is universities are going through deep crisis because they became managed enterprises of not academic, but social capital certification. If you have a degree, it's not a proof that you're clever and you're gonna invent something. Today, it's very much a proof that you can get a good job, and that's why people go to law rather than to something sensible.
I think, is that a good sentence to end on? All right. Well, many thanks again to Professor Jiří Přibáň.